Hey, sleepy travellers, where in the world are you watching from and how old are you? I love seeing our cozy little map light up in the comments. If this relaxing dive helps you unwind, a gentle like and a soft subscribe would mean a lot. Now let's drift back to a quieter time, when staying cool was an art. When the air grew heavy and the sun finally loosened its grip, families drifted to the front porch like moths to a cooler flame. The porch was more than a wooden platform. It was the summer living room, the family's breathing space, a shaded edge between home and open ski. Rockers creaked in slow rhythm, a metronome for conversation. Screen doors whispered shut and clicked, holding back mosquitoes while letting in the soft river of night air. Someone set a pitcher of water with lemon slices on a little table and watched the glass bead with condensation, a small shimmering proof that relief was possible. You could feel the change start at your collarbones, a breeze slipping across damp skin, stealing warmth as it went, turning sweat from discomfort into a personal cooling system. Cotton shirts loosened, bare feet found the slats of the floor, and the heat began to unclench. Porches were designed for this ritual. Deep overhangs threw generous shade. The roofline and open sides created a chimney for air to move, pulling heat up and away while cooler currents threaded in from the street. Houses sat a little higher off the ground so the space beneath could breathe, and that breath rose through the boards to meet you. In towns and country alike, trunks of trees doubled as ancient air towers, oaks and elms casting long canopies so sunlight arrived filtered and tired. Evening claimed the block one shadow at a time, and with each patch of shade the neighbourhood exhaled. Cross-ventilation started at the porch and travelled through the whole house like a gentle tide. Windows stood open in pairs so a light draft could cross from front to back, gathering momentum over polished floors and woven rugs. Curtains, light as a sigh, swelled and fell with each pulse of air, tracing invisible patterns in the dim. On hot nights, people moved quilts off the beds and hauled cots out to sleeping porches or unfolded daybeds near those open windows, learning exactly where the night breeze liked to wander. Children drifted off under the humming guard of the cicadas, while grown-ups talked around them in low voices, each sentence spaced by the clack of a distant train or the slow rattle of a passing wagon. Later a car easing by with windows down and elbows out. Mosquito netting and screens turned the porch into a soft fortress. You could sit close to the world without welcoming its bite. The screen's tiny grid made evening look like a photograph you could step through if you wanted, a streetlight halo, a neighbour waving from their own steps, the moon shouldering its way between tree limbs. Someone fanned themselves with a church programme, and someone else traced a cold ring on the tabletop with their glass. The rhythm of the night assembled itself from small constants. The fan of a hand, the creak of rope on a porch swing, the click of ice cubes in a mason jar, the footfall of a cat claiming the railing like a cool, narrow road. Around supper, heat was an opponent you didn't fight head-on, you simply outweighted it. The porch made waiting feel like something you did together. Cards slid across a crate-turned table. A radio murmured ball games and weather in a friendly, faraway voice. Shelling peas or snapping beans turned into an unhurried chore for whoever wanted busy fingers. If you were quiet for long enough, the air would change its mind about you. Towards a twilight, the breeze came down from wherever it had been hiding and set about loosening collars and lifting hair at the nape of the neck. Even the wood cooled under bare feet, the day's stored warmth draining away into the widening dark. Architecture learned from experience and passed along small techniques. A porch ceiling painted a calm pale blue wasn't just pretty. It borrowed a sliver of sky and tricked the eye into feeling cooler. And some saw it confused insects too. Railings were open enough to let air travel. Lattice below let the crawl space breathe. Steps faced the street to invite conversation. The more porches in sight of one another, the stronger the breeze of human company. When storms marched in, everyone watched from a safe stage, rain slanting across the yard and turning dust into that first clean smell of petrichor, temperature dropping 5 blessed degrees in as many minutes. In rural places, porches were command centres for the evening cool-down. After fields, after chores, after hot stoves and summer kitchens, you claimed your chair and let the breeze repair you. In towns, porches stitched blocks together into an outdoor parlour. A neighbour crossing by would pause, forearms on the rail, exchanging a few sentences that stretched into 45 minutes because no one had the energy to end them and no one wanted to either. The night carried voices kindly, rounding their edges and mixing them with the cricket choir so nothing sounded sharp. Laughter travelled the length of the street like a breeze with a sense of humour. Sleep found its way forward from the porch. Parents drifting in and out of talk would do the math of the night. Windows cracked this much, doors latched, fans angled to invite the outside air instead of merely pushing around the inside heat. Children were carried drowsy and pliant from swing to cot, from cot to bed, and the porch would hold their shapes a little while longer, the slight sway left in the chain, the pillow's faint warm spot where a head had been. If the night stayed stubborn and windless, you waited for the quiet currents that sneak in after midnight when roofs cool and yards exhale. If the breeze stayed faithful, you sat there together longer, aiming chairs so you could feel it full on the face. Even the smallest gestures belonged to the cooling craft. Wringing out a dishcloth and laying it across the back of the neck, misting the porch steps so the next draft picked up a hint of evaporation, turning off extra light so the air felt like the main attraction. Each choice made the breeze seem bolder. Stories unravelled slower in the dark, and complaints did too. Gravity softened. Stray dogs rearranged themselves on cooler patches of dirt. The night smelled of cut grass, creek water, tomatoes in the garden releasing green breath, hot tar on the road giving up its heat in tiny sighs. Far above, a plane's lights winked, and you could imagine that inside it was colder but lonelier, and that you had the better seat. This was how people stayed human in the heat, by moving to the edge of the house and letting night do what it has always done. The porch taught patience and angle, alignment and timing, the way sailors learn a wind by watching the first shiver in a sail. You waited for the air to turn its face toward you. You learned to notice the small pivot when it finally did. Then you leaned back and let your body become a quiet instrument the breeze could play, a slow chord that matched the rocking chair and the insects and the stars. And the night cooled you not with force, but with company and time, and the kind of stillness that gathers its own weather. Thick walls did the kind of work you never saw, the kind you only felt. In New England and the mid-Atlantic, stone farmhouses carried the day's heat in their shoulders like patient oxen, taking the sun without complaint while the rooms inside stayed temperate and dim. In the southwest, adobe blocks, earth, straw and water shaped by hand and sun stood broad and quiet, their mass drinking in the afternoon blaze, then returning it slowly to the night like a banker, repaying a careful debt. You could lean your back against a midday wall and feel the lesson. Heavy materials don't rush. They flatten the spike of noon and stretch it across the clock, so the house moves with a longer breath than the weather. This was cooling as timekeeping, a collaboration with the planet's own rhythm, the rooms at once shelter and instrument. Down a few wooden steps, sometimes stone ones rounded by generations of shoes, the air changed tone. The cellar met you with a hush, a deeper smell of damp earth and wood, of cured hams and potatoes, of pickled brine and cool stone. The temperature down there was not an opinion, it was a geologic fact. Earth a few feet below the surface stays near the mean annual temperature, 50-something degrees in many places, and a cellar borrowed that steadiness like a friend's calm voice during a hot-headed day. Shelves wore crocks and jars and brown bottles. A wooden bin held apples that breathed sweetly for weeks. Crock of butter sat half submerged in a pan of cool water, the surface reflecting the ceiling beams like a small motionless sky. You learned to manage heat as if it were livestock, feed it, pen it, move it where it belonged. By morning, you opened the cellar door to let the house trade its night court cool into the rooms above. By noon, you shut it and latched the bulkhead so the day's heat couldn't push its way down. Transoms above interior doors, iron floor grills and stairwells were tuned like valves. When evening came, you cracked windows high and low and let the house draw a long sip of air, the warm current rising up the stairwell while the cellar exhaled a slow draft across the floors. Even if no one said the word stack effect, they understood it under the skin. Hot air climbs, cool air settles, and a house can be a quiet chimney if you set it so. Walls were not naked, they wore their own summer clothes. Limewash turned stone and brick into pale reflectors that shed heat and shrugged off mildew, making the interior light feel like it had passed through a snowbank. Shutters were more than decoration, they were eyelids for the house. You closed them against the harshest hours so the room stayed drowsy, and opened them toward the evening so white and cool could enter on good terms. Trellises carried grapes or wisteria like green curtains that thickened the shade, and vine leaves breathed water into the air, a million tiny exhalations softening the square of sunlight on the floor. On farmsteads, trees were planted with deliberation, a tall shade to the west, a windbreak to the north, so the building had guardians at the exact angles where weather most often came hunting. In the cellar, the improvisations were everyday science. A clay jug dampened on the outside sat in a drift of cooler air, where the slight evaporation put a chill into the water, the same trick the human body uses with sweat. A pan of water under the table, a wet cloth over a bowl of milk, a crock of cream set near the low vent where the earth's breath moved. None of it was dramatic, all of it worked. Many houses kept a spring house apart from the kitchen, a tiny stone room built over running water. The stream slid through a channel, keeping the floor and the milk crocks close to the temperature of the earth's veins. And the gossip of the water made even the hottest afternoon feel less absolute. Kitchens themselves learned to step lightly in summer. Where possible, the big fire moved to a summer kitchen, an annex or an outdoor hearth, so the day's heat wasn't trapped in the centre of the house like a coal. Baking day shifted to dawn when walls still held night in their cores. Doors stood on opposing sides of the kitchen so you could call a breeze straight through while bread cooled on racks and pies steamed on windowsills. A Dutch door held the bottom closed against barn cats and toddlers, but let air and talk flow. It made the kitchen a cell of the larger house lung, breathing in the shade from the porch and breathing out the kitchen's own warmth to the yard. Regional wisdoms harmonized without ever meeting. On the plains, sod houses pressed their backs against the earth itself, their thick earthen walls gentle on the inside and surprisingly refined at keeping temperature steady. In Appalachia, stone basements and a clapboard home served as root cellar sanctuaries. In the desert, thick adobe paired with interior courtyards that stacked shade upon shade. The courtyard was a heat filter, bright at the top, cool in its deep corners, sometimes with a little water or a fig tree bleeding tinctures of green into the air. Even where courtyards were rare, the idea repeated itself. Narrow alleys between house and barn that made a wind corridor, service yards shaded by the laundry lines hung with white sheets that doubled as a sail for the smallest breeze. The craft included sound and light, not just temperature. Inside thick-walled rooms, summer echoed differently. Voices felt upholstered, footsteps went soft. Daylight arrived as a polite guest, reflected off white plaster rather than hurled indirectly through hot glass. Windows were deep set, their reveals becoming ledges, where you could sit with your knees up and a book, feeling the stones cool through your clothes. Children learned which flagstone kept its chill the longest, which cellar step felt like ice under the heel at sundown. Even the smell of the place cooled you. Chalk, dust, wood polish, the clean metallic whisper of a canning lid that had sealed properly months ago, but still somehow scented the air with confidence. Technologies that looked primitive at a glance were beautifully tuned to place. Ice houses, thick-walled mounds or stone vaults packed with sawdust and blocks hauled from winter ponds, stored cold like a season folded and put away. An icebox in the kitchen turned those stacked blocks into everyday mercy, keeping cream firm and greens crisp, while the cook worked more slowly, unhurried by the threat of spoilage. Bulkhead doors on the north side stayed shaded and took the lee sun. Vents were set low and high to create an unceasing whisper of air movement that didn't feel like a draft so much as an intention. Even cellar windows wore little awnings or planting beds so the glass sat behind a veil of leaf and shadow. The sun arriving already slowed down. The psychology of these rooms was as important as their physics. When you step into a cellar at noon, there is a visible lowering of the shoulders, an unclenching behind the eyes. People arrange their days to include that descent. Carry the jam down, bring up the onions, check the potatoes for sprouts, linger an extra minute just to listen to the wood settle and the faint drip of a pipe. A chair might appear near the bottom landing, not for long sitting, but for the kind of minute that resets a person. You learn to treat coolness not as a button you push, but as a relationship you maintain. Close the shutters before the sun hits, open the leeward windows first, sweep the steps so damp doesn't cling, skim the spring channel, turn the crock so the lids face the moving air. All of this worked because it acknowledged that a house is not separate from its ground. Foundations touched the soil and took instruction from it. Floors over crawl spaces were vented so the underbody of the house could breathe. In some places, a thin layer of crushed shell or gravel underlay the cellar to keep groundwater conversation steady but not intrusive. Builders sited structures on slight rises so cold air pools didn't sit against them at night, and summer breezes could brush their faces unhindered by hedges or fences piled in the wrong place. Awnings and deep eaves shaded windows like hats shade eyes. The small, wise laziness of putting the right thing in the right place replaced the frantic labour of forcing comfort where it didn't want to be. In the end, thick walls and cool cellars taught patience and proportion. They didn't defeat summer so much as translate it, turning the hammer blow of noon into the long, tolerable pressure of afternoon, trading panic for practice, heat for habit. You could feel it in the way people talked about weather then, as something to arrange your day around, to accommodate and befriend. It is still there if you look. The pale lime-washed wall that stays kind under your palm at 3 p.m, the cellar air that keeps its own calendar, the plum jar that sighs a little when you lift it from the cool shelf, and the quiet certainty as you climb the steps again into the soft, dim hallway that the house has been doing its steady, invisible work the whole time. Air doesn't need to be forced to be helpful, it likes being shown the way. A simple hand fan could turn a sweltering room into a private breeze, a pocket-sized weather system built from cardboard and a wooden tongue depressor. In hot churches and summer meeting halls, they bloomed in unison. Flip, flutter, hush. Painted with lilies, a calendar, sometimes a funeral home's dress beside a picture of a peaceful river. A fan was permission to move when everything else needed stillness. Wrist tracing a small arc, fabric collar stirring, a column of air passing across damp temples and turning sweat into chill. Children learn the physics by feel. Faster isn't always better, change the angle, let the air slide rather than slap. Grandmothers could fan without thinking, reading a hymn book in one hand while the other produced a breeze steady as a metronome. Ceiling fans brought that same civility down from above. Early ones whirred with cloth belts and distant motors. Later ones wore oak blades and a pull chain that clicked like a rosary. The speed settings had personalities. Low was a murmur, medium a conversation, high a rainy day at sea. The fan never bullied the room, it persuaded it. Air fell in a broad, gentle sheet, touched your skin, wandered toward the baseboards, and rose again along the walls to be gathered, turned, and sent back. In kitchens where the stove kept a private summer, a ceiling fan demoted heat from tyrant to loud neighbour. In bedrooms, it pushed a cool river over the bed covers and smoothed the night into sleep. Folks who paid attention learned to reverse the blades when seasons changed, nudging warm air down in winter and lifting it away in summer, less a trick than a habit. Box fans and window fans were the working-class heroes of the house wind. They lodged in the sash with the confidence of a cousin who knows where the glasses are kept, cords trailing to the nearest outlet like a kite string to the wrist. A fan facing in at dawn pulled the backyard into the kitchen. Tomatoes, wet grass, the newsboy's bicycle going past. By noon you flipped it around to throw heat out. People improvised borders from cardboard and towels to close the gaps, directing the flow like river engineers. A second fan on the shaded side, one pushing, one pulling, could turn a hallway into a breezeway. If you stood at the top of the stairs, you could feel the house inhale beneath your feet and exhale above your shoulders, a quiet promise that someone had opened the right things in the right order. Whole house fans were the great cathedral organs of summer. Mounted in the ceiling of the hallway or landing, they wore louvered doors that clapped softly when the blades began to swing. There was a ceremony to using them. Wait for the sun to let go, walk the rooms and unlatch windows a hand's width on the shaded sides, leave a few doors ajar so the currents could slip, then pull the switch. The louvers lifted. The motor came up from a hum to a purposeful purr, and a coolness you couldn't see started moving through your clothes. Papers rustled, curtains breathed inward. The porch screen tightened, reset and released like a drum. The fan pulled air from every crack and kindness, under doors, through keyholes, along transoms, gathering the house into one long sigh. The attic accepted the burden, sluicing heat out its vents and slats, the roof shedding the day like a lizard shedding skin. Attics were not just storage, they were weather management. Ridge vents, gable louvers and spinning turbines, whirlybirds that caught even a lazy breeze, kept the roof space from turning into a skillet. Hot air loves to climb, and if you give it a door at the top, it will take it. Cupolas made a virtue of that urge. Little lantern houses with slatted sides and a weather vane pointing at the day's intentions. Open the path upward and the rooms below relax. Close it and the heat hangs like a stubborn guest. People learn to listen. The attic air has a sound when it moves. Thin, dry, a distant rustling that tells you the house is lighter now than it was at noon. Flues and chimneys had summer jobs too. The same shaft that carried smoke in January could, with the damper set just so, become a draft ladder in July, drawing warm air up from parlour and kitchen the way a well pulls water from the ground. Even a stovepipe that wasn't lit could be a heat thief if you cracked the right window and gave it a reason. Old houses came wired with small intelligences like these. Transom windows above doors that flipped open with a brass hook and let heat escape without surrendering privacy. Stairwell landings with high sash that turned a staircase into a gentle chimney. Screen doors with spring hinges, so the pathways of air stayed open by default and closed themselves kindly behind you. Air likes roots with purpose, and the people who lived with it learned to choreograph. In the morning you invited the day's mildness. At mid-afternoon you shaded and shunted, keeping the heart of the house dim and slow. Toward evening you threw the entrances wide and turned on the whole house fan, making the walls feel porous and the rooms briefly outdoors. Families got good at the tiny math. Crack the west windows less, or the smell of hot tar takes over. Open the north bedroom more and the hallway stops feeling stuck. Tip the box fan on a chair so it skims the floor, not the ceiling. None of this was complicated, but it rewarded attention the way a garden does. Noise itself cooled the mind. The blade sound of a fan made a white river that carried off irritation. Window fans turned traffic into a distant ocean. Even a hand fan had a voice, paper on air, a whisper that matched the pulse in your neck. Proof that relief could be homemade. You could tell who was napping behind a shut door by the posture of the louvers and the shape the curtains took in the draught. In the deepest heat, the fan's hum was a truce flag. It said, "We'll meet the weather halfway." Churches and barbershops were classrooms for these arts. In the pews, 100 slow wrists made a collective climate. In the barber's chair, a ceiling fan kept talc drifting like snow and sent the smell of bay rum out the screen to the sidewalk. On trains, porters lifted long punka fans that rocked a slow rectangle of air down the car, a metered breeze that told passengers help was being considered even if the rails were melting. Porches strung with little oscillating fans watched their arcs sweep the room, the breeze coming to you and leaving without argument, polite as a neighbour's hello from the sidewalk. Sometimes the guidance was in the smallest edge. A rolled towel at a threshold kept the cool river from leaking away. A strip of tin tacked along the top of a doorway stiffened a screen so it wouldn't drum in a gust and break the spell. A bead chain on the pull switch found your fingers in the dark, the click as satisfying as a light verdict. Fan blades got dusted with an old pillowcase slipped over each wing. In the doing of it, you felt the weight that would have dragged at the motor and understood that maintenance too is a kind of breeze. What made all of this work was humility in the face of simple laws. Heat gathers high, air moves from more to less. A draft is a bargain between two openings. If you let the house whisper to itself, up the stairwell, through the transoms, out the attic, across the porch, comfort arrived without a shout. The difference between stifling and bearable was often a quarter-inch of window, the direction a fan faced, the patience to wait until the sky softened. A room doesn't have to be cold to be kind. It only has to be in motion, the way a river stays cleaner than a pond. On certain evenings you could stand in the hallway, hair lifting a little, and feel every choice you made all day add up to this. Blades turning, louvers breathing, the house lighter by degrees, and the air moving past your skin like a quiet friend on its unhurried way somewhere slightly cooler. Water was the most cooling tool because it worked with air and time. A basin on the porch step, a bucket beside the sink, a pitcher sweating on the table, each one made a pocket of relief that spread in rings you could almost see. People learned that when you wet a thing and give it a breeze, the air steals a little heat to pay for the evaporation. So you wrung out a cotton sheet and clipped it over an open window, and the next breath that passed through arrived friendlier, its edges softened by 1,000 tiny evaporations. You dampened a towel and draped it across the back of your neck, and your pulse quieted as the cloth cooled itself to comfort. You splashed the porch boards at dusk, and the wood exhaled a gentle chill as the water disappeared, turning the first night wind into something you could feel under your feet. Shade was the other half of the equation, a negative substance that you arranged with the care of furniture. A canvas awning rolled out above the sunny window like a calm eyelid. On farmhouses, striped fabric cast lazy zebras across the siding and subdued the light before it ever touched the glass. In town, storefronts wore metal canopies that made afternoon sidewalks possible, and families took the idea home, awnings of canvas or tin along the south and west sides, their angles chosen so summer sun was turned away, but winter sun still slipped under to warm the rooms. Deciduous trees were the great seasonal machines. A maple or an elm planted with intention could lay a moving carpet of shade over the house all summer, then drop its leaves and let the low winter light in when you needed it most. Vines did the same work in miniature. Grapes tugged along a trellis above a kitchen window, wisteria braided through a pergola, Virginia creeper marching across the porch rail. They inhaled sunlight and exhaled cool, each leaf a little hand shading the next. Courtyards and side yards became outdoor refrigerators if you tuned them, even without a single piece of machinery. A narrow passage between house and fence, once it wore a lattice with climbing beans and a string of damp laundry, turned into a green tunnel where air slowed down and carried away heat by increments. Laundry itself was part of the climate system. Wet shirts and sheets hung in the afternoon made their own breeze as they gave up water, cooling the strip of ground below and perfuming it with cotton and soap. You could stand under the line and feel it, a ribbon of air a few degrees kinder. The sun fractured into soft squares by fabric and clothespins. People learned to place chairs in those small rivers of relief the way you'd sit beside an actual stream, turning themselves by inches until the angle felt right. Water returned in small rituals that stitched the day together. Wash basins and enamel bowls waited on back stoops, not only for hand washing but for foot soaking, the kind of 5-minute reset that lowered a person's temperature and mood at once. A chipped pitcher poured over wrists and forearms, pulse points cooling the whole self more efficiently than a full dousing. At dinner, the table held a jar of mint leaves in water, not as a garnish but as a cooling herb that made breath feel fresher, a small trick the mouth sent to the mind. Pickles and chilled tomatoes came up from the cellar sweating like glass, their coolness felt before it was tasted. Children were sent out with canteens wrapped in damp cloth, and the containers themselves joined the conspiracy. Porous clay seeped just enough that the wind could do its work, turning a jug into a humble swamp cooler you could carry by the handle. In the southwest and other dry places, whole houses practiced evaporation as an art. Canvas-wrapped frames fit into windows, fed by a trickle of water from a hose. Air pushed through the damp weave and dropped in temperature as it took up moisture, turning rooms from oven to orchard in the span of a minute. Roof-mounted evaporative coolers, swamp coolers, because names go where the air goes, hummed like bees and tasted faintly of rain, blowing a soft, cool wind that made curtains belly, and people forgive the afternoon. Even without the machines, desert houses wore fountains the way a throat carries a sip, little basins where water climbed and fell and climbed again, not for spectacle but for the few feet of blessed microclimate it created. Sit within the splash radius, and the heat felt like a negotiable idea. Elsewhere, where humidity was already a heavy coat, water's job shifted from adding moisture to hiding from the sun and moving heat out of the house before it multiplied. Summer kitchens kept the boiling and frying outside. A lean-to with a tin roof, a shade tree, and a table was enough to keep the core of the house from becoming a stew pot. At canning time, you started before sunrise, jars clicking in a big pot while air still carried the last of the night's mercy. When the heat came up, you carried the work to the breeziest corner. Peaches skinned under the walnut shadow, beans snapped in the mottled shade of a lattice where vines exhaled a cool you could feel on your wrists. Even dishwater found a cooling purpose when it was thrown across dusty paths, tying down the day's heat with the smell of earth after brief rain. Windows learned to wear their own shades as skin. Bamboo roll-ups and reed mats filtered light into honey instead of fire. Slatted shutters let you talk to the wind without inviting the sun. A white curtain wet at the hem and left to sweep the sill turned into a soft, moving heat sink. People practiced the rhythm. Drop the shades before noon on the sunward side. Open them to the evening's breath. Leave the leeward windows cracked so the house never forgets to inhale. Awnings and vines weren't just decoration, they were agreements with the sky about how bright is too bright. A single patch of shade over the kitchen door could feel like a mercy bigger than its size, the temperature under it reading differently on the skin as you passed through, with a bowl of ice or a stack of plates. Gardens cooled the world beyond their borders. Mulch kept soil moist, and moist soil cooled the air just above it, making a low fog of comfort at ankle height. Tall corn planted in rows became green walls that shaded the ground and a person walking between them, their leaves transpiring all afternoon, each plant a silent fountain. A grape arbour over a picnic table turned lunch into a sanctuary where the sun showed up fragmented and kind, and where a pitcher of tea sweated in a way that felt like participation. Bird baths and stock tanks served double duty, water for thirsty living things and also mirrors that threw light back without heat, their surfaces ruffled by even reluctant breezes. The sound of a hose on a hot paver, the brief steam and the scent of warm stone turning cool convinced bodies that relief was present and not theoretical. Travellers learned the same lessons on the road. Canvas water bags hung from car bumpers or truck mirrors, wind and sun together turning the percolating damp into drinkable coolness inside. At campsites, people stretched tarps between trees, creating instant shade sails that took the bite out of noon and let a nap form on a folding cot. A wet bandana under a hat brim made a crown that cooled the scalp. A sun umbrella, once called a parasol without irony, cast a moving island of evening that you could carry in your hand. The simplest inventions became indispensable: a spray bottle and a breeze, a wide-brimmed straw hat that kept the horizon in shadow, a cotton shirt dunked, wrung, and worn until the fabric decided it was time to be light again. Inside, water kept working in smaller ways that added up. A ceramic crock of drinking water sat on a wooden stand, its lid slightly ajar so the faintest air could pass and keep the surface new. Cups were dipped directly, the act of pouring already cooler than turning a metal tap. Ice trays cracked with a sound that meant company was welcome. Lemonade pitchers fogged over like pond glass at dawn, and everyone drank from the cold first, then the sweet, because order mattered and bodies listened. Floors were mopped not only to clean but to invite that minute of cool evaporation, where the hall smells like soap and the air goes soft. Even sleep wore water. A dampened sheet pulled over tired legs, a washcloth folded across the brow like a benediction, a bowl near the bed to refresh them without a journey through hot rooms, none of it complicated, all of it precise. Architects, whether titled or self-made, used shadow as a building material. Deep eaves acted like hats, clerestory windows lifted the hottest light away from eye level, breezeways connected rooms like stream beds, and verandas wrapped houses with navigable dusk all afternoon. On city blocks, light wells brought sky down without heat, and interior shutters made noon into morning by turning harsh rays into reflected cooler glow. Even paint worked like shade if you chose it right. Lime wash and pale colours returned sunlight to the street instead of accepting it wholesale. Roofs brightened to bounce heat back to the sky. Dark trim receded so the eye found the cool surfaces first. A house could feel tenable before you even crossed its threshold because the front steps sat in dappled shade and the doorknob wasn't hot. The physics ran under everything like a low river. Evaporation steals heat. Shade interrupts radiation. Moving air accelerates both. But the experience was human scale. It lived in the way a grandmother tested the air by opening the screen with her hip and deciding if the sheet needed one more ring. It lived in the timing of watering the garden right before supper, so the yard cooled for evening, and the smell of mint and tomato vines rose to meet you. It lived in the decision to eat on the north side instead of the west, to bring the tin cups from the freezer just as the dog stretched out on the damp patch under the lilac, to sit where the vine's shadow fell like lace on the table, and watch the beads gather and join and finally run down the glass in a line that looked like a tiny river, a promise that the air around you was learning to be gentle again. Winter made the cold that summer would live on, and whole communities learned to store January for July. When the first real freeze sealed the ponds and lakes into matte plates, men walked the ice with augers and long poles, sounding for thickness and listening for the clean wooden note that meant it would bear more than a person. A horse-drawn plough cuts straight, repeating grooves across the surface like the lines on a schoolbook page, scoring a grid into the blue. The cold did the arithmetic overnight. By morning the seams had tightened, each rectangle defined, and crews with saws, long-toothed and methodical, knelt to turn water into cargo. Blocks rose shining from their birthplaces, 2 feet thick and heavy as a person, hoisted with iron tongs that bit the corners and swung them to a waiting conveyor. The day had its own smell, fresh water, iron, leather, horse breath, and the clean, sappy odour of sawdust that would later cradle the ice like straw cradles eggs. Ice houses stood by the shore like barns invented by winter. Their double walls were packed with sawdust or straw, floors sloped to drains, roofs vented to gather and expel breath, every board planed to tighten the world against warmth. Men stacked blocks in staggered courses with the care of masons, sawdust fluffed into every seam, pathways left for later retrieval, the bulk a kind of sleeping glacier held fast by patience and insulation. Outside, the lake would thaw and go green again, dragonflies hunting in the reeds as if the cold had never ruled there. Inside, the temperature held to a steady, near-frozen, months-long promise that summer's pantry would be different this year. A ledger by the door told of what lay within. Dates, thickness, the quality of the crop, black ice clear as glass, or snow ice white and soft-grained, each mark a plan for the heat to come. In cities, the winter harvest linked to a longer chain that reached doorsteps. Wagons groaned along morning routes, wheels ringing on cobbles, horses shouldered with bells and leather, drivers in caps with the brim pulled low against glare. A painted sign in the kitchen window, ice, held numbers at its corners. You turned the card so the number you wanted sat upright. 25, 50, 75, 100. The iceman read that code from the street the way a musician reads notes, stopped, gripped his tongs, and slung a block onto a shoulder pad that kept cold and wet from biting through. He climbed stoops and courtyards, moved with the offhand strength of someone who carries weather in their arms all day, and left the block where the housewife pointed, by the back door if she took it herself, into the icebox if she let him pass. Children knew the sounds, ice sliding on wood, the quick chop of an ice pick as chips flew like glass birds, the thud of a block settling into its nest. They begged for the slivers, and the iceman was generous, flicking a handful into waiting hands where they vanished into mouths and onto dusty tongues like a private snowstorm in August. The icebox itself was a quiet machine with no cord, a piece of furniture that made a kitchen modern by degrees. Outside it was oak or enamel, polished brass hinges, a door latch that sealed with a certain satisfaction. Inside it was metal-lined, zinc, tin, later porcelain. So meltwater didn't creep into wood and odours couldn't get ideas. The top compartment held the block. Cold fell from it the way fog sinks into a valley, and everything below arranged itself around that invisible weather. Milk and cream lived closest to the source, butter in a covered dish that stayed firm enough to slice, eggs in a rack that kept them from risk, leftover meat wrapped in butcher paper that blushed and then held steady. The house had rules about the box: open it quickly and for a reason, put the hot stew on the counter to cool before it goes in, wipe the tray, empty the drip pan before it overflows and leaves a damp confession on the floorboards. Someone tucked a saucer of baking soda in the corner and felt as if they had given the air inside a conscience. The icebox changed the calendar and the menu. Cream lasted past the day after churning, meaning ice cream could be fantasy and then fact, a backyard crank freezer turning salt and ice into a thick happiness that came blue-veined with cold. Fish could travel from the coast to the county, layered on ice in the fishmonger's cart, their eyes still bright enough to look like a promise. Butchers wrapped cuts that didn't have to be eaten that afternoon. Leftovers held their shape and dignity overnight. Salads crisped instead of wilting into apology. Breweries and saloons understood cold as a sales pitch. Beer pulled from an ice chest slid into a glass with its breath showing, and the first sip was temperature before it was taste. Soda fountains identified themselves with a sound, the clink of tongs in a bin, the hiss of carbonated water meeting syrup over a drift of chipped ice. And suddenly summer afternoons could be taken by the glass in manageable doses. Behind the domestic comforts, an economy of cold stretched across regions and oceans. In the 19th century, ships out of New England loaded their holds with blocks cut from ponds that had known winter since glaciers left, insulated with sawdust and rice hulls, and carried this manufactured season to places that barely knew frost. Havana, Charleston, New Orleans, Bombay, Calcutta, or Rio. The ships bled weight with every day under equatorial sun, but enough arrived to change a hospital, a market, a hotel lobby. Newspapers wrote about the first iced drinks in places that had never tasted them, the way the glass gathered dew and made the hand believe in miracles. Closer to home, railcars stuffed with lake ice moved west and south, and packing houses learned to layer meat in cold, lowering the risk of spoilage from an everyday hazard to a manageable chore. Even fresh produce learned a new pace. Lettuce loaded cool stayed crisp across miles. Strawberries made it to a different county with their perfume intact. Harvest days were feats of choreography and hazard. Crews worked within inches of freezing water, footing uncertain, their wool mittens soaked, then spackling when the sun hit the ice sugar coating. There were rules born of necessity. Never soar alone, keep a pole within reach, know how to roll your body flat if you break through so the ice edge doesn't cut you while you crawl back to a line of hands. Horses wore spiked shoes to keep them honest. Men scattered ashes or sawdust to make paths, a tawny map across the blue. In the ice house, a wrong step could be a slide and a fall between blocks, a cold splintered canyon where someone's voice suddenly sounded far away, so they moved like workers on a high scaffold, sure but deliberate, every motion a shout of experience. By midsummer, the iceman's shoulders had a permanent map of his work, a cooled ache living under the muscle, a crease where the pad rode, a whitened patch of skin that spent every day pressed against a borrowed winter. He knew every back door, every kitchen clock that ran fast, every dog that barked more than it bit. He took script or tickets from households with accounts, coins from others, pies or jars of pickles as thanks from a few who settled bills with what they had. In tenement neighbourhoods, a single big block might be bought by the building and chipped down for each family. The stairwell wet with the drip and the relief shared like shade. When supply ran tight late in the season, sawdust became more precious than anyone expected, its insulating weakness the difference between hungry milk and safe milk. Meltwater was not waste, but a system. The pan beneath the icebox had to be emptied before dinner, or else the house learned about gravity and patience the hard way. In some kitchens, a pipe carried the drip through the wall to a bucket outside, and you could trace the icebox day by the darkened stripe on the dirt beneath, a small wetness that attracted thirsty birds. The taste of the ice mattered. People became connoisseurs without meaning to. Pond ice was sweet and clear. River ice could carry silt and rumour. Artificial ice from the new urban ice plants had a flat, distilled silence to it that some swore made lemonade less lively, others insisted made it purer. Public health departments began to take an interest, inspectors learning the names of ponds and the habits of companies, because spoiled ice could carry more than coolness, and no one wanted a fever disguised as a luxury. Mechanized ice factories grew up in the gaps where winter was unreliable or demand outran lakes. Ammonia compressors sang in brick buildings with tall windows, coils hissed, brine tanks held grids of metal cans where water froze by order rather than by season. The product was regular as bricks, stamped and sized, convenient for the wagons that now loaded from a dock instead of a shoreline. The iceman cared that it held. The housewife cared that it lasted through the night and let breakfast milk pour cold. A kitchen could swap allegiances and barely notice. Lake ice one year, plant ice the next, the ritual unchanged. Turn the ice card, listen for wheels, open the door quickly, close it with the latch's little oath. Ice's presence changed even how heat was made. Stoves were minded differently when cold could be kept. You cooked in batches, cooled and saved, spread the work across days instead of cramming it into the fading safety of morning. Markets shifted their hours to meet the wagon, fish peddlers rolling crushed ice over their catch with a scoop that flashed in the sun. Confectioners became engineers of cold sherbets and custards turned from special occasion theatre into repeatable pleasures, saltpetre and salt tricking the ice into colder than itself. Metal canisters spun smooth by hand in a family circle that collected stories while it collected frost. Hotels made lobbies into caves of relief with bowls of ice wrapped in linen at the front desk, and a glass of something cold given without being asked, the way a person offers a chair to someone who looks unsteady. There were small domestic arts tucked inside the larger infrastructure. People learned to wrap a block in newspaper if it would travel far from the wagon to the box. They kept the ice compartment full to preserve the mass because a well-fed cold lasts longer than a skinny one. They placed items by their need. Cream within arm's reach of the block, vegetables further away, cheese wrapped to avoid learning everyone else's secrets. On very hot days, someone chipped extra into a bowl and set it in the icebox. Not to eat, but to fatten the climate, the way you add kindling to a fire to keep the big logs honest. Children earned the privilege of the ice pick only after proving a respect for its point and the understanding that ice, in fickle summer, is a kind of treasure that you portion carefully. The world outside the kitchen registered the ice age by sound and posture. In the back alleys, the slight constant jingle of harness hardware mixed with the soft thunder of a block sliding. On corners near parks, push carts sold shaved ice treats, syrup staining paper cones and carnival stripes, the vendors' hands pink and quick from contact with cold. The air around the cart 5 degrees kinder if you stood very close. In hospitals and sick rooms, a chipped glass rattled ice on command and the patient's face changed, because cooling from the inside out convinces a body that survival is plausible. In barber shops, towels soaked, wrung, and laid across faces came off just in time to be replaced by a palm dipped in a bowl where ice clinked among herbs. The skin learning in a second the difference between raw and relieved. By late summer, the ice house told the truth of the year. If the winter had been generous and the stacking careful, there was still a layered monolith within, the sawdust fragrant and dry, the blocks wearing softened edges but holding their composure. If spring had come too early or the harvest been interrupted by a thaw, the inventory ran thin and prices climbed like temperature. People paid anyway because by then the kitchen had grown used to a baseline of cool. Milk soured quickly without it. Tempers did too. The iceman knew whose pantries were resilient and whose depended on his shoulder and his route, and his ledger became a weather report of a different kind, a list of households tethered to a winter that lay 3 towns and 6 months away. The season bent around the block in the box the way a river bends around a stone. Breakfast included the clink of ice in a glass of water that tasted different because it was cold. Lunch became safe to postpone until after errands because the sandwich meat waited comfortably in the chill. Supper invited a salad that had not wilted, a custard that had set cleanly, a bottle that came to the table beaded and promising. At night, someone lifted the icebox door just before bed, felt the cool leap to the face, judged the block with fingers that had learned its language, and decided whether to put the ICE card at 25 or 50 for morning, trusting a chain that ran from hand to tongs to wagon to lake to winter, back to the quiet kitchen where the latch clicked and the house, for a little while longer, remembered what January felt like in July. Comfort began with cloth that cooperated. Summer wardrobes were less about fashion than about physics, loose weaves that let light through, natural fibres that could absorb a little sweat and give it back to the air as coolness, cuts that invited movement not as spectacle but as ventilation. Cotton, linen, muslin, lawn, fabrics that sounded like pale colours even when they were not, hung off the skin with a deliberate indifference. A shirt with room in the shoulders, a dress with ease under the arms, a skirt that swung away from the knees. Each choice made a private breeze possible. Seams were not prisons, they were suggestions. People knew the difference between a collar that nagged heat into anger and one that sat open like a friendly window. Buttons stayed undone by the quiet agreement. Top 2 for work, top 3 for evenings on the porch, because nobody won a fight with July by cinching themselves into it. Linen behaved like a kind friend who wrinkles in sympathy and stays cool anyway. Its rumples were not failure but proof of service. Cotton gauze and voile fluttered around wrists and throats, little curtains that lifted and fell with each step. Seersucker came alive where the air touched it, the puckered stripes making small ridges that lifted fabric from the skin so heat could go somewhere else. Madras bled colour in the wash like a watercolour left in the rain, then wore those softened hues into the afternoon as if it had soaked up part of the sky and kept it. Even denim knew when to yield. Chambray and light twill turned the idea of work clothes into something a breeze could understand. Hats were architecture on the move. A straw boater drew a circle of shade that travelled with you, brim laying the world back a few degrees. A Panama or a wide-brim field hat kept the forehead dry enough that thoughts could continue. Inside the crown, a grosgrain band wicked off the business of the day and evaporated it into the air you'd already decided was manageable. Women carried parasols that made the sun think twice. A portable arbour you could tilt by inches. Lace casting patterned shade that felt cooler because it looked like water on stone. Not all umbrellas were for rain. A pale parasol was an argument with noon that you could win by walking slowly, letting your shadow keep up. Feet learned a smaller weather. Bare ankles caught drafts that trousers ignored. Sandals adjusted to the thermostat of a person one toe at a time, and even closed shoes were lined with linen or canvas to avoid trapping what the skin wanted to forget. Socks thinned to whispers. People dusted their feet with a bit of starch or talc before walking out, tiny rituals that changed the day as surely as breakfast. In certain towns, the shady side of the street was the side with more shoe shops because customers lingered there, testing leather by feel and temperature, deciding whether a sole respected the pavement enough to give back a little cool. The body's own geography was consulted like a map. A damp cloth at the wrists, the crook of the elbow, the neck's hollow, cooling where blood travels closest to the surface changed the rate of everything else. A handkerchief, moistened and folded, became a portable evening, slipped under a hatband or tucked into a waistband where it could quietly interfere with heat. People knew to sit with forearms on a wooden table rather than a cloth one, to lean their spines against plaster instead of upholstery, to choose a cane chair over a cushioned one, because the little gaps in the weave were vents. Furniture itself learned to breathe. Wicker and rattan, rush seats and canebacks, materials with holes inside their own logic, light enough to move towards shade without making a project of it. Daily schedules were rearranged by consent with the weather. Work started earlier, not from virtue but from physics. The morning belonged to errands, to washing, to baking, if baking had to be done, to anything that involved fire or effort that refused to be rescheduled. Midday dissolved into a quieter grammar. Shops pinned up a sign that said back at 2 and meant it. Counting houses tallied in a slower hand. Fields went as still as a held breath except for the irrigation channels talking to themselves. Hammocks took on official duties. Slung under porches and between trees, the body lay diagonally because someone discovered that angle turned a sling into a bed and a breeze into a sleeping partner. Cots moved outdoors without ceremony. A nap wasn't indulgence. It was how the day parcelled out its survivable hours. Meals practiced temperature as etiquette. Breakfast aspired to cool. Slices of melon beaded at the edges, milk that had kept its nerve in the icebox, bread toasted quickly and not in the hottest part of the stove. Midday often turned to the pantry and the garden rather than the range. Tomatoes salted into sweetness, cucumbers cut thin as ribbon, hard-boiled eggs that needed only a pinch, cold chicken speaking softly from last night's platter. The pitcher on the table wore mint, lemon, or sliced peaches when they were available. Not decoration, but chemistry. Iced tea took on a regional certainty, brewed strong in the morning and set to calm with its own weather of clinking cubes by afternoon. Sweetened where sweetness was considered an insurance against heat and left plain where the day insisted on austerity. A metal spoon against a glass made a sound older than the radio and more useful, a little bell that called everyone to the idea that cold could be poured. Habit modified posture. People learned to walk slower and arrive cooler. Pauses were built into the route. A stop in a shaded doorway. A chat beneath the courthouse elms. A moment at the water pump to wet a wrist. The shady side of the street belonged to those who knew the town. The sunny side to those in a hurry, and you could tell the difference in the way their shoulders sat. Letters were written from a table placed where air moved, not where light was brightest. A book lay open with a folded sheet marking a place, both for page and for a quick fanning. Sewing happened near a window where the needle could flash without the seamstress cooking in the light. Hems were turned with fingers that had learned to keep their own shade. Clothing maintenance bent toward coolness. Starch became lighter in summer, so shirts didn't turn into armour. Layers peeled back by the latitude and custom. A waistcoat lost on weekdays became a sincere strategy rather than a statement. Colours softened. Whites and creams and undyed tones returned sunlight back to the sky instead of accepting it into the fabric. Laundries hung sheets toward the breezier side of a yard, so they dried with a kind of cool memory stitched into them. Sleeping between crisp cotton felt like lying inside a breeze that was trying to remember last night. Beds traded heavy coverlets for summer quilts and thin blankets. Pillows were shaken to free heat like dust, and sometimes they were turned in the middle of the night without waking entirely. A practice manoeuvre that gave the cheek a new continent to rest on. Grooming adjusted, not out of vanity, but as apparatus. Hair lifted from the neck, swept into buns, braids or shortcuts that let the scalp talk with the air. Beards trimmed closer for the season, or were kept with more attention to dryness. A dab of witch hazel behind the ears, a splash of bay rum on the hands, a dusting of rice powder at the collar. Scents that smell like the absence of heat rather than the presence of perfume. Barber shop towels cooled faces into receptivity. A farm sink did the same at home with a quick clean rinse that reset a person's mood as much as their temperature. Clothing went back on cool, and only then saw the afternoon. Children were allowed a different uniform entirely. Barefoot alliances with dirt paths and creek banks. Linen smocks that could be soaked and dried without anyone issuing a memo. Straw hats that shed the day's arguments with a shake. They learned microclimates before they could spell the word. The strip of shade beside a fence. The cool under a grape arbour. The trick of lying on a porch in the path of a fan. The way a damp shirt and a good breeze turn into laughter without effort. Their games naturally found themselves in the cooler parts of the yard as the sun moved. Tag that drifted northward. Hide and seek that respected the trees as partners rather than just obstacles. Work uniforms had their own treaties with weather. Carriers and clerks wore lighter woolens unlined. The seaming kept minimal, so air could conspire with effort. White aprons reflected heat in kitchens where fire was non-negotiable. High paper hats lifted the scalp from steam. On rail platforms, porters tilted caps and found the only current available between two cars. In fields, Brim and bandana made a climate under a sky that had decided on ruthless. A wet kerchief at the throat made cotton bearable for hours longer than pride alone. Language changed to accommodate sanity. Come sit a spell meant recovery as well as conversation. I'll be by in the cool of the evening was scheduling that respected physics. We'll do it in the morning was a contract everyone signed without a pen. Upholstery on parlour chairs wore summer slipcovers in pale cloth, washable, breathable, transforming the same chair into a kinder idea. Rugs retreated to closets, floors went bare to shine back whatever breeze touched them, and the sound of feet on wood became part of the season's music. Doors stood open with screened companions, and latches developed a muscle memory that kept bugs out and air in without slamming. Even tools adopted a temperature. Fans were not only machines but gestures, folding fans in pockets and purses, church fans tucked into hymnals, a palm leaf at the picnic that served as both plate and breeze maker. Sewing patterns added vents and godettes. A shirt's back yoke received a hidden pleat that made reaching not only easier but cooler. Tailors and dressmakers were quiet engineers, placing a seam here, a gusset there, moving a button stand a finger's width to let the neckline lie open, at an angle that invited air while preserving modesty required by time and place. In some towns, a linen day appeared as unofficial policy in offices, where the ledger needed to be kept, but the human keeping it could not be expected to sweat through a wool suit to do so. The slow-living part was not laziness, but tactics. You watered the garden near sundown not only because plants benefited, but because the yard's skin cooled, and gave that cool back to you when you finally sat. You walked home under trees even if it added a minute. You let conversations lengthen, because talk is a kind of shade that speech makes when it stands between you and your chores. You chose the shade-side pew, the north-facing stoop, the bench with the back that didn't trap heat against your spine. When the newspaper advised readers to drink water before they felt thirsty, people listened. When a neighbour suggested a pinch of salt with that water after a day of fieldwork, bodies thanked the advice quietly. Pickles were not just for flavour, but for minerals. Cold soups and fruit were not fashion, but plan. Everything slow counted as a kind of intelligence, the way you buttoned half your collar, the way you turned the hem one extra time so the fabric didn't cling, the way you set a chair where the night air would find it first and then, without looking at the clock, found yourself already there when it arrived. Maybe tonight, as you turn off a few extra lights and listen for the smallest hint of a breeze, you can feel the old ways breathing alongside you. The porch waiting like a friend on the edge of the house, the walls holding the evening steady, the attic whispering to the sky, a damp cloth cooling the pulse at your wrist. A memory of clinking ice telling you that relief can be simple and handmade. We didn't outmuscle the heat so much as outlearn it. We watched the sun's angles and planted our shade where it would grow into mercy. We let air move instead of trying to cage it. We stored winter in sawdust and carried it into July on a strong shoulder. We dressed for cooperation rather than combat, and scheduled our lives around kindness instead of stubbornness. There's a tenderness in that, an ordinary genius that still fits inside any home, any apartment window, any stoop where someone sets down a glass and waits for the night to do what nights have always done. If any of this stirred a memory, your grandmother's porch swing with its tired chain and cool patch of shade under the fig tree, your dad turning the fan around in the window at dusk like a sailor changing tack, a cellar that smelled like stone and apples where the afternoon always felt like morning, tell me about it in the comments. I want to hear your small clevernesses, how your town keeps its cool the way an old brick building stays kind at noon. The trick with the sheet over the window, the grape arbour that drops the temperature by a handful of degrees and raises spirits by twice that. Share the rituals you still keep, the mint you bruise with your fingers before it goes into the pitcher, the hat you swear is 5 degrees cooler than any other hat, the way you water the garden at sundown so the ground makes a little night of its own. Your stories teach the rest of us what to try next, and they turn this channel into a porch we all get to sit on for a while. If this gentle drift through older comforts helped you unwind or kept you company while you rested, a soft like and a quiet subscribe would mean a lot. That little tap tells the algorithm to pour you another glass of shade. If you want these nighttime rambles to find you again, you can ring the bell like a screen door closing softly behind you. And if you know someone who would sleep better with the sound of fans and summer kitchens in their ears, pass this along, send them a patch of evening. I'm always collecting what to explore next. Maybe we'll wander through the cool geometry of desert courtyards and wind towers, or step into the hush of an old library where the air is kept like a promise, or travel the world's sleepiest streets to see how different places fold the heat into their days without letting it break the night. Maybe we'll sit with the people who built these tricks into their houses and their habits, the quiet architects armed with paint, vines, and patience. Or we'll go smaller still and follow a single breeze from the edge of a field to the thread of a curtain, watching it pick up the scent of water and set it down in a room where someone is finally exhaling. Before you go, take a second for one last kindness to yourself. Loosen the collar, set the phone face down, let the shoulders drop. Open a window if the air outside is even a little friendlier than the air inside. Turn your pillow to the cool side as a gift to your future self. Put a glass in the freezer for tomorrow and make tomorrow grateful. The body remembers these gestures and the mind follows. That's the secret inside all of this. Cool is not just a number, it's a rhythm. You can keep it with ordinary tools and a little attention, shade where it counts, air where it wants to go, water where it helps, a pace that respects the hour. Thank you for staying up with me and letting me read this to you while the night stitched itself together beyond the window screen. Wherever you are in the world, however old or young your summer has made you, I'm glad you're here. Leave me a note about the temperature of your evening, the sound your fan is making right now, the flavour of the ice in your glass, the first breeze you felt today that made you believe the heat would be manageable after all. We'll gather those details like fireflies and let them light the way to the next quiet story, the next practical miracle, the next small thing that helps you drift a little easier into sleep. Until then, may your walls be patient, your shade well aimed, your water close at hand, your night air generous, and your dreams as cool and steady as a porch in the dark.